and welcome everybody to this BCSD Australia Sprint, a conversation about matters that influence and impact our membership and the broader business community in Australia. Hello and welcome. My name is Andrew Petersen and I am the CEO of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia. And I am joining you this afternoon on the land of the Wiradjuri people of the Woiwurrung community. In other words, I'm in Melbourne, which I don't usually get to say. So I'm very honoured and privileged to be able to say that I'm joining from these lands of the traditional custodians. And indeed, I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who are joining us today. So what's this all about, Andrew? Why did you organise this event so quickly, and what do I need to know about it? The session, Supplying Government Responsible Business, focuses on the brand new Commonwealth Procurement Rules, which are in fact taking effect from next Monday, the 17th of November. And they change what it means to be a credible supplier to the Australian government. Now, we at BCSDA see this as a shift and a part of a broader movement linking governance, transparency and ethical conduct to sustainable business performance. So our goal today is to make the practical implications of these changes clear and help you as business, large, medium and small, prepare to prove responsible business practice. And I'm delighted that we're going to be joined today by Lily Morton, who is a solicitor at Gilbert Tobin, Gilbert Tobin being a highly valued member of the BCSD Australia community. The Gilbert Tobin team specialise in a number of different topical legal areas, but today they're going to be looking at the issue of public procurement, compliance and sustainability related governance. And in conversations with Lily, we've agreed that she's going to outline what's changing under the new CPRs. I get to bring that expression back. I'm so excited. It's actually just CPR, but you add an S at the end of it to turn it into a longer word. And how, and how suppliers can demonstrate ethical conduct, governance and readiness. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lily. And Lily is going to be making a presentation with a slide presentation that she has prepared all by herself without any assistance. So make sure that you comment in the chat function how exciting and fantastic it was. Over to you, Lily.
Wonderful. Thanks very much for that introduction, Andrew, and lovely to see everyone on the line today. Thank you for joining our webinar on the new Commonwealth Procurement Rules. So I'm just going to bring up my slideshow. Just bear with me for a moment. Okay. Is that coming up well, Andrew? Perfect. Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining today's session on Commonwealth Procurement Rules. My name's Lily Morton. As Andrew mentioned, I'm a lawyer in the banking and projects practice at Gilbert Tobin in Sydney, specialising in climate change and sustainability and a lot around ESG and responsible business. So really interested to unpack today how this intersects with Commonwealth Procurement Rules and being a Commonwealth supplier. So I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm dialing in from today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all First Nations joining us today. So today I'm going to unpack the Commonwealth Procurement Rules, which have recently been finalised and come into effect from next week, the 17th of November. And these represent the most significant changes to the Commonwealth Procurement Rules in almost a decade. And we've got changes to thresholds for the first time in 20 years. So quite a change to how suppliers will be approaching procurement for Commonwealth and also being assessed. So Today, I'm going to provide an overview of just a bit of a refresher of what the CPRs are and how they work, step through the key reforms that are coming into effect from next week, talk through what are some practical tips for supply readiness, and what might be some resources that are useful to refer to, and some other key developments that intersect with these new rules. So what are the CPRs? The CPRs are issued under the Public Governance, Performance and Accountability Act and basically set out the rules and principles and the framework for how both non-corporate Commonwealth entities, sometimes referred to as NCEs, and prescribed corporate Commonwealth entities procure their goods and services from non-Commonwealth companies. So the CPRs are designed to ensure that procurement is conducted with integrity, transparency, and value for money, while supporting broader government objectives. So in simple terms, where a government department or agency wants to procure goods or services, the CPRs set out how they're going to do these. And as I've noted, we've got changes coming into effect, which are the most significant that we've seen in a very long time. So the CPR framework is set into two divisions, and while sounding technical, this comes quite relevant because a lot of the changes are switching which division certain rules are coming into. So Division 1 is the rules and fundamental principles that will apply to all procurements, irrespective of the value of that procurement. And this addresses principles and rules such as value for money. So the procurement is a good high value for money, including also non-financial factors and a consideration of the whole of life costs and quality of the service being provided. Another principle is that competition is fairly encouraged, which also drives a value for money service. Also that we have an efficient and effective, economical and ethical procurement, and that ethical wing we'll come back to very shortly because that's been recently enhanced. And this basically sets out that we're upholding high standards where services are being provided to the Commonwealth, and that throughout the procurement process, we're managing any conflicts of interest and ensuring transparency around the information that's provided by suppliers and the information that Commonwealth is assessing throughout that process. Ethical conduct, as I said, we will come back to in more detail, but it's also important to note here that both the Commonwealth and suppliers are also bound by the Commonwealth Supplier Code of Conduct, and that's now a core component of the CPRs. Another element of the framework, Division 1, is accountability and transparency. And this is that there's a clear process for how tenders will be advertised, how they'll be awarded, and that this is done through the Oz tender process, and that there's clear record keeping. And also often a requirement for feedback to be provided back to bidders. And that's so that there's a communication cycle around how tenders are being applied for and awarded. Then we've also got another element around procurement risk, and this is that Commonwealth identifies and undertakes due diligence to ensure that the services it is procuring don't have any risks attached to them, they're in accordance with regulation, and that there's mitigation strategies in place for where any risks do occur. And the last wing of Division 1 is that there's a sustainability element to that procurement. And this brings in your broader factors around environmental management of the goods and services being provided, is there compliance with regulations, and also supporting initiatives that generally promote good sustainability. So collectively, these principles work to ensure that Commonwealth procurement is undertaken with integrity, promotes fair and ethical competition, and is responsibly resourcing its services. So Division 2 applies as an additional overlay to certain procurements that are of a larger size and come in above a prescribed threshold. And we're going to come to this again in just a moment because that threshold has been increased. And this effectively adds some additional procedures around negotiation processes, timelines, and confidential information where we do have those higher value procurements that are going through an additional open to market process. So the other thing to note here is that Appendix A will list certain exemptions that won't apply to the CPRs, and that's recently been clarified to also include real property, government-to-government procurement, and also certain international assistance. And the final thing to note here as well is that there's also an overlay of other policies and procedures that need to come into the consideration process for tendering for Commonwealth goods and provision of goods and services, and that includes the Indigenous procurement policy, which was implemented in 2015 and also recently updated earlier this year, and other coordinated procurement arrangements, which can affect how you will be applying for goods and services. So the key changes that have recently been finalised and come into effect from 17 November 2025. Now, there's a full suite of changes, and there's a really handy document on the Department of Finance's website, which is a table of the key changes. And to go through this in granular detail, and encourage you to have a look at that as well. It's quite a helpful resource. But there's at least 8 key changes that are particularly relevant for suppliers to be really well across and understanding how this impacts their business and how they're going to be tendering for work in the future. Now, the first is that the procurement thresholds have been increased, as I said, for the first time in about 20 years. Basically from the general procurement threshold, which will trigger the requirement for an open approach to market, will increase from $80,000 to $125,000, inclusive of GST. And this applies to all relevant entities, so non-corporate Commonwealth entities, as well as statutory bodies. But do note that for construction services, the relevant threshold remains at the $7.5 million level. But what this means is that more procurements will fall below the open tender line and outside of the detailed Division 2 rules, which generally means that it's a more streamlined process to apply for procurement. Second, we've got a codified prioritisation of Australian businesses, whereby non-corporate entities must only invite Australian businesses in the first instance, where they're seeking submissions for procurements that are valued above $10,000 but below that new $125,000 threshold, or the $7.5 million threshold for construction services. Now, previously in the CPRs, we had a non-discrimination rule, which was in that Division 1 and applied to all types of procurements. And that meant that there couldn't be any discrimination between tenderers. And that included whether you're an Australian business or a foreign business. Now that non-discrimination rule has been moved to Division 2, which means in that Division 1, under the $125,000 threshold for procurements, the Commonwealth Government is allowed to, in effect, discriminate, but by inviting only Australian businesses. So some concerns have been raised about how this fits in with Australia's international treaty obligations, but the Commonwealth has assured that the way it's been implemented is adherent with all of those and effectively provides Australian businesses an extra opportunity to get involved and have more opportunities to be considered for those procurement opportunities under the $125,000 threshold. And there's also been a definition of Australian businesses added to the appendix for the CPRs. And this requires that a business to be considered an Australian business has to have 50% or more Australian ownership, or is principally traded on Australian equities markets, has Australian tax residency, a principal place of business in Australia, and also for procurements under that $125,000 threshold, New Zealand businesses are also now included as Australian businesses. And from 1 July 2026, the Australian AusTender platform will also require entities to specify why a contract was not awarded to an Australian or New Zealand business where the new preferencing rules apply. So this is really great opportunity for Australian businesses. And the additional new opportunity is for small and medium enterprises. So the amendments have also embedded that for those procurements under $125,000, not only does it need to go to an Australian business in the first instance, but also embed a prioritisation of small and medium enterprise businesses. And this is where there are standing contracts sourced from, for example, the Management Advisory Services Panel, the People Panel, or any other standing offer managed by the Digital Transformation and agencies. Non-corporate Commonwealth entities will have to invite only SMEs in the first instance to make submissions. And the definition of SME has also been updated to mean an Australian or New Zealand business with fewer than 200 full-time equivalent employees. So these changes together are expected to foster more opportunity for Australian and New Zealand SMEs. And there'll also be a new searchable supplier platform portal, which has been also launched on the Department of Finance's website, which will assist agencies in identifying whether a business is an Indigenous business, an SME, an Australian business, or a woman-owned business as well. Fourth, we've got some new requirements around ethical conduct being embedded in the consideration of value for money. And this now requires that the Commonwealth entity needs to make reasonable inquiries that a procurement is being carried or will be carried out in compliance with regulations. And that's now expressly included as a requirement in Division 1, which will apply to all types of procurements. Now, Commonwealth entities will have to just consider a supplier's ethical conduct in addition to its experience and performance history for all procurements. And in practice, this is likely going to lead to greater consideration of what's the tenderer's internal governance processes? What's its processes for modern slavery, reporting and management? Does it have fraud control purposes? Is it compliant with new anti-money laundering regime? And what's its integrity processes across all contract values? So that's further accompanied as well by enhanced compliance obligations to do with screening and checks, which will also be intensified with Commonwealth entities required to make reasonable inquiries into the supplier's compliance with work health and safety, environmental impacts, and labour regulations. So fifth, we've got some new clarifications around the negotiation process, and this applies if you're above that $125,000 threshold and come into the Division 2 framework. And this is that entities may conduct negotiations only if the intention to negotiate is signalled in the approach to market documentation, or if following the Commonwealth's evaluation, no single tenderer offered the best value for money. So there's a few additional technicalities around that, and there's also some new accompanying guidance issued by the Department of Finance to guide entities through this new process. Six, there's some clarification around the fact that submissions will now be able to be shared confidentially but between government entities for legitimate government purposes, basically building out processes, policy development, any research, compliance, or regulation. So that's important for suppliers to keep in mind now that their submission might be shared for internal purposes within the Commonwealth Government, where it's still compliant with the CPR processes. We've also seen a few of those CPRs updated to address findings from the recent ANAO procurement complaints handling audit, which was undertaken in 2023. And those changes also focus on standards compliance, specification drafting, and ensuring equitable treatment of suppliers. Finally, we've also seen some clarification around what does and doesn't constitute as procurement. And a really key one that's come out of this is that secondees between government entities and government departments will not be considered procurement for the purposes of CPRs. So that's a bit of a crash course on the key changes, and do encourage you to have a look at the new document in detail, the new CPRs in detail, and obviously the table of amendments as well is a really handy checklist to understand exactly what has and hasn't changed. So stepping into what are some practical tips for supplier readiness, so these come into effect from 17 November 2025, and they will be applied from any submission thereafter. So it's really important that to get ahead of this, you're having a look at your procurement pipeline, any submissions that you've got coming up, any submissions that you think you will be making, and checking that you've got your processes in order to be able to comply with the new CPRs. And the really key one to get up front is that you're validating and documenting your status, where you are going to leverage those characterizations as an Australian business, as an SME. You've got that in accordance with the new declarations and the self-assessment forms that the government has put out. And especially for any new procurements that are coming through that are above the new thresholds, really important that the new negotiation processes and the confidentiality provisions are understood really well so that you're ready to tackle those and understand how they're going to work. Second, have a look at your templates and your documentation for your procurement processes, and understand what are your approach to market documentation. Does that now align with the new CPRs and your evaluation plans and criteria, and also looking at those declarations and self-assessment forms so that when you go to put in your new procurement submission, it aligns with the new templates and requirements. And look, the third bigger kind of holistic approach to be looking at is that as I've stepped through, these CPRs are going to encourage and require the government to do further due diligence on suppliers that are tendering for work. And in doing that, they're going to have a much thorough look through your internal policies, procedures, and governance processes. So this is a really good opportunity to ensure that you've got your modern slavery reporting in order, your work health and safety and environmental standard processes in order, that you're compliant with the supplier code of conduct, expectations, and that you've got your internal reporting and due diligence processes in place. And on this point, this feeds into a bit of a general overview in regard to your ESG sophistication. And the updating of the CPRs really reflects a broader Australian market expectation that there is more information and transparency around internal governance and your internal ESG considerations. And the CPR requirements really straddle each part of E, S, and G within those disclosure requirements. So while you're taking this opportunity, build up your internal processes. Also be cognizant that we've got other regulatory reforms coming through. Climate-related financial disclosure came into effect this year. So any entities caught within that will have to be updating their internal governance processes for those disclosure regimes in any event. We've got modern slavery regulations recently under review and currently under consultation by the government. So we might see more stringent due diligence and internal processes required around modern slavery as well. And anti-money laundering also came through a huge regulatory review and update this year. So it's really the time to be coming up to speed with what your internal governance processes look like. Are they up to scratch for Commonwealth procurement? And are they also up to scratch for broader regulatory environment? So on a very final point, a few other resources and key developments to be abreast of and ensure that you're following is that get up to speed with the new supplier portal. That's going to be a really good source of information and understanding different suppliers and their characteristics and also how you present as a supplier. The Department of Finance is also regularly putting out new guidance and they're updating their existing guidance materials to encapsulate the new CPRs. And this includes that there is a new declaration form and there's some guidance on contract negotiations. So really encourage you to go have a look at those. Also remain abreast of those interconnecting policies. So the Indigenous procurement policy that I mentioned earlier, that also had some updating features to it earlier this year, and also the Commonwealth Supplier Code of Conduct. Lastly, as a few adjacent work streams, we've also had the Department of Finance recently release its updated Australian Government Contract Management Guide. That was just in August this year, and a resource management guide regarding conflicts of interest and confidentiality with the non-government sector. So I'll probably wrap up my opening remarks there and see if we've got any questions to jump into, but really happy to have a discussion about any of these new CPRs that have come through, what the updates mean, and also how companies should be managing their general oversight of internal governance and responsible business. So thank you very much, Andrew, and I'll open up for any questions that might have popped through the chat.
Thanks, Lily. Do you want to take off the slide just so that the two of us feature prominently on the screen? Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions, and they really, firstly, let me go back. Clarity and comprehensiveness, that was fantastic. Really, really good. So that was really an instructive, step by step. One of the questions that came through, which is an interesting one from my perspective, was does it apply to current contracts and or variations to current contracts? So come Monday, if there is a variation to an existing procurement contract, will these provisions apply to that contract?
Generally speaking, the new updates are not retrospective, so they won't apply to any contracts that existed before the 17th of November. Whether they come into apply to variations, I think will depend on the specific contract and will depend on how that contract variation or contract extension is undertaken. It might be the Commonwealth's view that for certain suppliers, it is appropriate to bring in the new CPRs from contract variations, and that will probably most likely be the case from 17th November. But any contracts already in force prior to the 17th of November will not be subject to the new CPRs unless there's a new contract coming into place.
Right. Thank you for that. The next question, what's the most practical first step to demonstrate ethical conduct, particularly if you in the business have never had to document that before? What's your observation and or advice or experience to companies? around that?
That's a really great question, Andrew, and whoever's put that in the chat. Look, there's so many elements that come into that ethical conduct perspective, and there's a lot of different lenses to looking at ethical conduct. I think depending where your business is at and what stage you're at, what's the most important thing to show is that you've got a robust internal governance. And there's many different ways to show this, but if you've got a robust internal governance, a way of identifying issues, reporting those issues up to management and dealing with those issues, that's your first step to demonstrate that you've got a way of managing, ensuring that conduct is undertaken ethically within your business, and that when issues arise, they're dealt with appropriately. And once you've got that framework, that feeds into everything. If you've got a modern slavery risk, if you've got an environmental risk, if you've got a pollution incident. So I think that's your number one step, is to have a look at what's your internal governance process. Where are issues identified? How are they reported and how are they managed?
Yep.
Is that documented anywhere? Can you have that documented in your board charter or your committee charters or another form of internal document? And ensure that you're starting to train your business on what those reporting structures look like. I think that's your number one overarching umbrella, basic 101. And from then you can start to build that out for each of your different types of ethical conduct. And that's when you start bringing in your environmental, your modern slavery, your AML, etc.
Okay,
to any more specifics on that.
That's really practical framing, so thank you for that. A related question is, conscious of the opportunity now because of the threshold going from 80 to 125,000 and this new definition of small being 200, I think it was 200 employees, was that correct?
Time equivalent.
Which is interesting because that's different to the ATO, but we'll move on from that one. The question is framed around, so how should those small suppliers actually prepare documentation and governance evidence efficiently? Because some may not have started this, some may have it in parts. And obviously from an SME's perspective, this kind of, on one view, new added regulation, whilst the opportunity is higher, does come at a cost and a time and resources factor for those particular businesses. So any guidance on how they could draw down on what's already there? Are there templates that can be used? What's your observations?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that is a really important thing to keep in mind. A lot of SMEs aren't going to have ample resources or existing practices to rely upon. And to get up to the standard that, perhaps might appear to be the standard, that's a huge uplift. And I think the first thing to say is that the Commonwealth is generally cognizant of this. What they're trying to do is, first point is that they're trying to open up these opportunities because they're cognizant that there are differences in the resources available. And if you are comparing a tender from a really small, medium business in Australia to a really sophisticated multinational business, there is going to be quite striking differences sometimes between the sophistication of those applications. So the first thing I'd say is that the reforms themselves have been undertaken in part to address that gap in sophistication of resources. The second thing that I would say is, start small. If you're a small, medium enterprise, you don't have really sophisticated resources, that's okay. Demonstrate what you have. And a lot of the time, what's really important is, even if you don't have steps in place, say what you're starting to look at. Like, identify what you're doing to improve those steps. Best endeavours are really considered within these government assessments. All they want to know is that, what have you got in place? What are you doing about it? And how are you going to improve that? Yep. Being transparent and disclosing is one of the biggest things in both Commonwealth and government procurement in general, but also to investors and your stakeholders. So they're probably my two-prong answers. It's been done to address that. And second, build out what you can, and it's an iterative process.
Yeah, well, I mean,
practical steps, there are guidelines on the website as well. Sorry, Andrew.
Okay, that's also very instructive. And you would think that ethical conduct in that sense would be, what steps are you taking as distinct from what document are you going to show that you've got ethical behaviour, or you've documented your so-called ethical behaviour. So that's very helpful. Last question. If you could leave the attendees with one actionable step to be taken before Monday, what would it be?
I'm going to do two, only because the
Oh,
one
all
is
right
probably
then.
very simple and most, but check your status. Make sure that you can actually meet an Australian or SME if you're going to be relying on either of those.
Yep.
But for a lot of people, that's going to be really obvious. So that's just the first one. And then the first or second, if you are doing that first one, is have a look at your upcoming procurement pipeline. What are you applying for in the next couple of weeks, couple of months? Target those, pop those in your calendar, make sure you've got them, and start reviewing the documentation that you're going to need to put into that submission by that date to make sure that it complies with those CPRs. And check the new CPRs, make sure they're across, make sure you're across those changes and have that incorporated into your next procurement application. So that would be my tangible takeaway.
Wonderful. Thank you for that kind of clarity that business always needs. So with that, let's now close out because we're at the top of the hour. Thank you very much for making this topic, complex topic, quite clear. And thanks to those who've joined. We'll be circulating the slides and the recording and a link to G&T for those seeking deeper advice. BCSD, as it always does, will continue to convene these sessions to connect responsible business practice with performance. So perhaps, Lily, we should come back in 6 months and see how it's all working or not, and what are some of the life lessons out of the practices that are going on at the moment, and is it actually creating value and impact, not just for government, but also for business as well. So stay tuned for those upcoming briefings. Have a great Friday, everybody. And as I always say, look forward to seeing you somewhere in the future. Bye for now.
Thanks all. Bye.